Damos inicio ahora al primer panel de la jornada. Para eso invitamos a Mark Jekanowski, presidente de Perspectivas Agrícolas del Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos, quien disertará acerca de la situación del mercado internacional de granos. Le damos la bienvenida. Con ustedes, el señor Mark Jekanowski.
Okay, buenos días. Let me test this out real quick here. Does the pointer work down here?
Yeah, no,
Okay, good. Okay, buenos dias. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be here with you today, and I'd like to thank Jose with the Bolsa and Minister Echeverry for the invitation. Really looking forward to this. My first time in Buenos Aires, and enjoying the weather, enjoying the scenery, and I'm going to enjoy giving you a little bit of a background and an update on world agricultural crop conditions from the USDA. I'm with the World Agricultural Outlook Board of USDA, and I've been working in ag markets pretty much all my life. Grew up on a farm in Massachusetts in the United States. A farm that doesn't compete with any Argentinian producers. We grow cigar wrapper tobacco and vegetables, but farming has been in my family and in my blood my whole life, and now I'm honored to be with you today to discuss a little bit about the U.S. and world global grain and oilseed outlook. So just to kind of set the stage, a little bit of a background about where we are right now and the season that we've had coming into this crop year. A little bit of a reminder, back in the U.S., from the U.S. perspective, we had a very cool, wet spring. Really delayed plantings by record amounts. Record amounts of acreage did not get planted because it was so wet and so cool. However, since given the market signals, producers worked as hard as they could to get as much acreage in as they did, and in fact, right now, acreage especially for corn and soybeans in the United States exceeds earlier expectations by a fair amount, and yields are coming in, or at least estimated to be, a lot higher than we would have anticipated given the spring planting. Harvest is about ready to begin. Corn harvest is about ready to begin, just starting out in some of the earlier planted parts of the U.S., but it'll come into full swing here in the next few weeks. The other thing that we're looking at is relatively soft demand for U.S. crops. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we progress. So, again, just for a little bit of perspective on where we are with corn progress. Historic delays in terms of the percent that's mature. We're only at, so 2 weeks ago we were at 18% mature, down from the 5-year average, which should be about 21%, we're about 21 percentage points below the 5-year average. Now, these numbers that are on the screen are actually from 2 weeks ago. The newest data came out while I was on the plane flying to Buenos Aires, so let me just update you with that. As of last week, percent of corn mature was at 29%. And for some perspective, the 5-year average relative to last week should be about 57% mature. So we're roughly a week to 10 days behind schedule in terms of corn progress in the U.S. The last year where we saw such a slow maturing progress of corn was in 2009, when we were at just under 26% this time of year. Conditions relatively poor relative to the average, but still a little bit better than expected. The areas of the U.S. where we see the least amount of corn in good to excellent conditions are areas like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, places where the corn was particularly delayed in the spring. It was extremely wet, and that corn really never got off to a good start and continues to be behind in terms of its quality. But still, overall, I think the crop is looking a lot better than most people expected or would have expected early in the growing season, given the delays that we've seen. So what does that mean for our supply and demand balance? Well, so these numbers are right out of our latest WSDA, the August 12th WSDA. And what you see here, the September 10th WSDA. And what you see here is, as of September, we did trim our yield a little bit, dropped our yield by about 1.2 bushels per acre. Dropped our yields by about 1.2 bushels per acre. That reduced our production, but the interesting thing, or the important thing to keep in mind, that actually our usage numbers fell more than our production numbers. So at the end, even with our little bit of a trimming of the yield for September, we're still coming in at a little bit higher ending stocks in September relative to what we thought in August, because our export market has been relatively weak. We're facing a lot of competition in the export market, and our domestic demand market is relatively weak as well. Ethanol demand has been flat or even declining a bit, so we're expecting those trends to continue going forward. So in the U.S., again, what we're facing is a relatively large crop, bigger than we would have expected given the planting conditions early in the season, but still relatively large stocks, relatively large carryout, and prices that are quite a bit below what they were in the spring, under a lot of pressure. So speaking of exports, let's talk about that just real briefly to set the stage. You know, historically, as you probably are aware, U.S. used to be the dominant corn export supplier on the world market. Our exports have been, over time, relatively flat, but we've seen a lot of new competition, growing competition, especially from Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine. So we're maintaining our exports on a volume basis, but starting to lose market share. And then on the world stage, world corn production for 2019-20, we see it down, but most of the decline in corn production on a global scale is due to reductions in the U.S., whereas many of the other countries, many of our competing countries are continuing to grow. Now, we're going to focus just real briefly a little bit on Ukraine, because again, they're an emerging exporter, a big competitor, emerging competitor. Now, in our September 10th WSDA, we did trim their output slightly, but still we see them growing year over year in terms of their production. So as a little bit of a review, hopefully for most of you, this is just a map of where in Ukraine the main corn production areas are, and the different oblasts that account for the majority of production. So corn production fairly widespread across the country, but kind of centered around the middle of the country. Now, Going into August, for example, Ukraine was looking at very favorable conditions. They had a relatively cool, wet spring and early growing season. This map is just a satellite imagery map that where essentially dark blue means very lush conditions. So we were looking at a very lush crop going into early August. But then interestingly, right after August, almost the day after the WSDA report came out, the rain stopped and things dried down considerably. Now, the crop was relatively mature. It wasn't completely mature, but it was fairly well advanced. So the damage was probably limited, but because the conditions did deteriorate late in the season, we trimmed yield by about 1% as of September. But even with that little bit of a trimming of the yield, we're still looking at record production for 2019, for the 2019 crop, second highest yield on record. So again, Ukraine is a major force on the global market, and obviously in terms of their production, their season aligns almost perfectly with the U.S. in terms of planting, harvesting, and availability on the export markets. So real quickly, let's talk a bit about the world balance sheet for corn. As I noted a bit earlier, production, we're actually seeing, production for 2019-20, a decrease going into this new crop year, mostly due to the reduction of the size of the crop in the U.S. The result is that ending stocks are tightening, but the fact is they're still relatively large, and it's mostly the United States that's carrying the burden of these excess ending stocks. So most of our other trading partners export more quickly right after production. We store a lot of our corn, try to export counter-seasonally, and even with our lower production, we're still looking at relatively high ending stocks. And it's probably also worth noting that while production is down, usage is down as well. But production is down slightly more. Again, it reemphasizes the need to grow demand growth in order to dig out of the ending stock situation that we're facing. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about soybeans. Very similar situation as with corn. Delayed crop, very slow planting. Now, soybeans have a little bit longer planting window than corn. There were expectations early on that with the late planting of the U.S. corn crop, that more acreage would shift to soybeans. Really, that did not happen. Instead, the market signals were such that farmers had an incentive to try to plant corn if they could. Again, especially in the U.S., we're sitting on record large soybean stocks and a lot of uncertainty regarding trade with China. So farmers were pretty reluctant to go big into soybeans. If they had any chance to plant corn, even if that corn was late, they were going to try to plant corn. But in any case, the soybeans that did got in relatively late, and progress is way behind schedule. And again, just like before, these numbers are from 2 weeks ago, but I have the more recent ones that were released on Monday. So as of last week, we have about 34% of U.S. soybeans dropping leaves. The 5-year average for this time of year is 59%. So again, we're about a week to 8 or 9 days behind in terms of where we should be in terms of progress. And the most recent year where we can go back to find similarly delayed soybean progress for this time of year is 1996. So this is really a historic delay in terms of our soybean maturity for this time of year. Conditions similar to with corn, relatively poor, especially in the areas where the crop went in late, especially through northern Ohio, northern Indiana, into Minnesota. But in some of the areas on the outskirts of the Corn Belt that really didn't face the extremely wet conditions early on, conditions are actually quite favorable, and in some cases close to or above the 5-year average. So, U.S. supply and demand balance sheet. Again, this is from our September 10th WSDA. Main change here, again, we trimmed yield just a bit, 0.6 of a bushel. And again, it's worth pointing out that even with the little bit of a trimming of yield for both corn and soybeans in September, these yields are still a lot higher than what a lot of the trade expected them to be, given the conditions. But nevertheless, NASS is estimating a reduction in yield that brought down our production estimate a bit for 2019-20 for this current crop, tightened up our balance sheet, and at the same time we also reduced our beginning stocks, reflecting what turned out to be a little bit better export demand than we expected and stronger crush than we expected. So for soybeans, partly because of the very low prices, demand has been relatively strong over the past several months, and we've moved out a lot more of that old crop than we were expecting to. So we trimmed our beginning stocks, trimmed our production, and in the end, we dropped our ending stocks by quite a bit, 115 million bushels. Just last year we were at over a billion bushels looking at this crop going in. So we are drawing down those stocks, but stocks continue to be record high for the U.S. and under a lot of uncertainty because of the situation with China. So real quickly, I think this is a pretty interesting chart for setting the stage regarding our situation on the global market, global exports. As you well know, back last summer, China imposed 25% tariffs on U.S. soybeans. The result of that almost immediately was to create a large gap between U.S. prices and South American prices, and that this dotted red line, this is basically the U.S. price plus 25%. So it's kind of a rough estimate of what an importer in China would have to pay if they were paying the tariff to import U.S. soybeans. So this gave a lot of market share to South America for a period of time, but then that premium for South American soybeans really started to disappear as soon as China started buying, even occasionally, U.S. soybeans, to the point where we are now. The premium, it comes and goes, but for the most part, it has disappeared over the past 6 months or so. And to show the effect of what that did for U.S. exports, soybean exports, it's really pretty remarkable. Historically, we always were a huge exporter. This is total soybean exports to all destinations. The bulk of our exports were always early in our marketing year. So we were exporting soybeans pretty much right off of the harvester. not storing a lot, relatively speaking. So big jump in exports at harvest, and then exports would kind of fade away to some degree. This year, having lost the China market at harvest, our exports were low during harvest, but now especially if we look at the end of the marketing year, June, July, August, record US soybean exports relative to those months. Focusing on China, I think this chart really also drives home the point. Historically, we used to ship almost all of our soybeans to China right off harvest. This year, practically none, but China did start putting in some orders later in the marketing year, and we've seen relatively strong sales in recent months. As a result, we found new markets. Given our prices, given our price discount, especially relative to South America, we started shipping a lot more to other destinations, a lot of little destinations, Mexico, Indonesia. No real dominant market in here, just a whole lot of small markets that saw that US soybeans were on sale, and they stepped up their purchases. Real quick, if we're thinking about soybean exports, it's hard not to think also about China demand, and one of the big wild cards going into next year and probably for years to come is African swine fever and what that will mean for global soybean imports by China. The difficult thing about China, as you know, it's hard to get good information out of China. Estimates range from anywhere from 10% to 50% of their swine population might be affected by African swine fever. We just don't know for sure. One thing we haven't seen the big increase in pork imports by China, especially pork imports from the US that we had been hoping for or expecting. We also haven't really seen a big decline in China's soybean crush. So both of those factors together kind of suggest, well, maybe they still have a demand for soybeans. Maybe their swine market hasn't been affected quite as much at the extreme end, but nevertheless, just given the widespread number of outbreaks throughout the country over the past year, this is something to watch that we expect is going to have a big impact on both soybean markets and animal protein markets going forward. So, world soybean production. Real quick, again, on the global market, the biggest reduction in supply is coming from the United States. Most of the competing countries are increasing or relatively flat production. For Argentina, last year, as you know, record production. This year, very early estimate for USDA. Basically, we're assuming trend yields because that's all, that's really all we can assume. That's what we always assume going in this early into the season. So again, relatively large crop for Argentina, though maybe not currently, assuming trend yields as big as last year. Supply and use. Main point here, balance sheet is tightening, mainly due to reduced production in the U.S., but still, by and large, carrying a lot of stocks, mostly stocks in the U.S., prices remain depressed. But we're glad to see, in any case, the balance sheet tightening to some degree. Real quickly on wheat, just a few minutes here, kind of to set the stage. Key developments from the U.S. perspective and global perspective. In the U.S., our winter wheat harvest is complete. The spring wheat harvest is ongoing, but it's delayed because of wet wet weather in our northern plains area. That's going to have some impact on quality, likely as well. But on the global level, wheat production, wheat supplies are very large, really a lot larger than we would have expected going into the season, given the hot weather in the northern hemisphere and given the conditions. But that's what we're facing, very large supplies, though some emerging concerns about drought in the southern hemisphere, as I'm sure you are aware. World wheat production, let me see my notes. So, key point here, very high production, and production increasing across almost all of the northern hemisphere areas. EU production up quite a bit, Canada up. So everyone, all of the major wheat producers seem to have a good year in terms of their winter wheat crop. But we do have some concerns going forward about some of the southern hemisphere countries, and we'll take a quick diversion into Australia, where we see some emerging issues with drought. Just as a quick review reminder of where in Australia wheat is produced, there's basically two main growing regions, one in Western Australia, and then it kind of follows the coast along through southern Australia into Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. And what we're really seeing this year is very similar to the situation that Australia had last year. Relatively good moisture in Western Australia, in parts of southern Australia and Victoria, but in this part of the wheat belt, the eastern part of the country, New South Wales and in Queensland, extremely dry, in some cases drier than last year. So as a result, as of right now, we're trimming our yield and production outlook for Australia wheat down a bit, but assuming normal weather going forward from here on out, we still have production up a little bit for Australia. That, of course, is subject to change based on weather and growing conditions going forward. Wheat supply and use, as I mentioned, big supplies, demand growing as well, actually relatively strong demand for, relatively strong wheat demand, but supplies growing faster, resulting in a fairly sizable increase in stocks and relatively depressed prices. U.S. balance sheet, in September we actually made no changes. There was really nothing to change in terms of the data we had, but we did drop our price, just reflecting the global supply condition that's really been weighing on prices. So, real quick summary, if I were to kind of give just a really brief overview of what we're looking at in terms of the global supply and demand conditions for grains and oilseeds. Relatively abundant supplies for both grains and oilseed, despite some pretty tough weather conditions in the U.S. and other parts of the world. Relatively weak demand in many cases. In the U.S., we've been focused heavily on U.S.-China trade relations, and of course, those issues reverberate throughout the world, throughout the global grain trade, and we expect that to continue. It seems to be kind of the new normal. We don't try to forecast policy, but we certainly don't see anything to suggest that these tensions are going to be resolved anytime soon. The other thing that we're watching is African swine fever, both from the standpoint of soybean export demand as well as global and U.S. pork export demand and other animal proteins as well, given what looks like a pretty major dent in China's pork industry. So that's all I have. If I have time for a question or two, I'm happy to take one.
Bien. Muy bien, muchísimas gracias al señor Mark Jekanowski. Tenemos unas preguntas del público. La primera pregunta. ¿Espera que se convierta en capacidad de crushing de soja debido al exceso de oferta en Estados Unidos? ¿Cree que las tensiones comerciales son el nuevo escenario habitual? Esa sería la primera pregunta.
Okay, that's good. So, are we expecting investment in soybean crushing capacity due to excess supply in the U.S.? That's a good question, and as of right now, we're not factoring into our projections expectations for increased crushing capacity. We are at record crushing capacity right now. We're crushing record amount of soybeans, but I think it's difficult for investors to assume that these current trade tensions are going to persist. We hope that within any investment planning horizon, issues between U.S. and China will be resolved, and we'll return to, being a major exporter of soybeans instead of, trying to consume more of them domestically. So I don't think, as of right now, and again, we're still relatively early into the trade war, as of right now, I don't expect that we're going to see any big increase in soybean crushing capacity beyond maybe just normal investments that we would have seen routinely. And let's see, do you believe that trade transitions are the new regular scenario? Boy, that's a tough one. They seem to be, under this administration has really made a point of trying to hold China accountable. It hasn't shown a lot of interest in quick compromises for quick resolutions. So yeah, and I think that we do see as the new normal just this amount, a new amount of uncertainty with China, and our regular scenario is probably, going forward for the next year or two, our regular scenario is probably more similar to what last year's scenario was regarding trade, instead of what it would have been like 2 or 3 years ago.
Bien, y la segunda pregunta, que llega a través del 15 56 21 36, es la siguiente. En los últimos reportes USDA, la diferencia entre estimación de producción oficial y privada ha sido creciente. En el escenario cercano, ¿está planeado un nuevo ajuste para reducir esa diferencia?
Okay, so this is a really good question, very interesting. So in the last WSDA, the difference between the official and private estimation of production have been increasing. That's absolutely true. And then it asks, in the near future, are you planning a new adjustment in order to reduce that difference? Well, so at USDA, we're always looking for new ways. We're always innovating, looking for new ways to use data, new ways to look at satellite imagery and different types of data. But it's important to point out that the numbers that USDA put out, the NAS numbers that went into the WSDA, are in fact, they're based on a survey of what producers told us that they were going to do. So to the extent that the private sector was surprised by the NAS numbers, really what they're saying is they're surprised by what US farmers reported in terms of what their acreage and expected yields were. So we're pretty confident in the NAS numbers. There's not a whole lot of adjustment that goes into them. We're really aggregating what the farmers are telling us and reporting those numbers with some, some adjustment for non-response, and we did do some resurveying where crops were extremely delayed. But This essentially is the same process that NASS has been using for decades, and nothing changed this year that would suggest that our numbers are any less accurate than they've been in years past. So certainly we're going to always continue to look for new and better and innovative ways of doing things, but at its heart, the way we calculate those acreage and yield numbers is the way we're going to continue to do it, because it still, we believe, is the best method out there.
Agradecemos la presencia de Mark Jekanowski. Lo despedimos con un fuerte aplauso. Él es presidente de Perspectivas Agrícolas del Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos.